politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Will Miller, a political scientist currently employed at Jacksonville University as Executive Director of Institutional Analytics, Effectiveness, and Strategic Planning. And joining me today is Brian Smikowski, a political scientist at the University of Idaho. Welcome back, Brian.
Hey, Will.
Excited to talk today. I think we have a nice, diverse group of topics, which on Saturday's show, it didn't feel that way, as obviously we were still talking about Trump, and we get to diversify a little bit here, which I think will be good, although Trump's obviously always going to be in these conversations. And I really want to start, Brian, by talking about Mayor Pete. And that may seem weird to start a show leading off, but I think when we look at Mayor Pete's fundraising from the most recent quarter, I think a lot of people are probably a little surprised. Mayor Pete was obviously a likable guy. He had a pretty quick rise, but to sit and have the fundraising numbers that he did, I think took a lot of people by surprise, probably shocked some of his fellow 3,000 competitors as well. So I guess my question to start with is, what do you think makes Mayor Pete so likable? It sounds like such a basic question, but in reality, I mean, he seems like the guy that's the friendly, likable guy. And I think when you look at the debate stage, you got guys like Cory Booker and Joe Biden sitting there saying, like, we were supposed to be the likable ones, and Mayor Pete's beating us at our own game.
I think he taps into this dimension that's out there of it's almost cool to like him. It's almost cool to support him, right? Because if you think about what he's bringing to the table, we could talk about him being, young. We could talk about his identity. We could talk about his military service. We could talk about being multilingual. We could talk about the charismatic effect. It almost seems Parks and Rec-ish in a way where it's like the small town mayor, instead of crashing the economy with an ice rink or whatever it was, is having this meteoric, rise. I still see it as like a hot flash because he's done a lot of fundraising that's had an immediate impact and has garnered a lot of attention. And let's face it, attention follows money, because right now we're talking about this because here's a guy who's mayor of a town with 102,000 people or something like that. And
Touchdown Jesus.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so the question is why? What's the special sauce here? Well, I think part of it is it's kind of cool to say, I want to get behind the person who represents all these things. I want to get behind the person who's, bringing identity to the forefront. So when we look at, the celebrities that are backing him, from, Mandy Moore to Michael J. Fox, to George Takei and to Barbara Streisand and Jennifer Aniston, here's a person who is, tapping into a segment of the celebrity world that makes people stop and pause and say why. And we can see the reason why. And we're like, oh, this is the cool hip person who we should be getting behind, right? We haven't had a candidate like this. We should get behind him. I still think that it's going to be a pretty limited flash. It's a very hot flash, but it's going to be limited. And when you look at the fundraising time period, he did bring in a lot of money in a relatively short period of time. And some will say, look at how he's raised more money than than Biden. But the reality is, Biden during the last quarter started raising money later than Mayor Pete did. And actually on a daily basis, if you break it down day by day, his funding is significant, but it's also not as astonishing when you look at it in comparison to what other people like Joe Biden have been able to bring in on pretty short notice.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. And I think we can also make the case, obviously, that everything that Mayor Pete's sort of making here is building from zero versus somebody like Biden who has a war chest, whether it's in place or not, or has the ability to make a few phone calls and trump these numbers without a whole lot of effort on his end. But I do agree. I mean, I think it's the interest level. And I mean, Mayor Pete and what he does on Twitter and his husband, I think plays a role here as well. I mean, and again, I mean, not saying there that Mayor Pete being gay is part of the story. That's part of the story in and of itself. But his husband's a likable, kind of aloof guy that's fun to watch and interesting to observe. And it's fun to see their dynamic and the discussions and the debates and, the bigger debates and the smaller little inner fights they let play publicly out. I think there's a lot there. When I look at Mayor Pete, though, the thing that concerns me for him, and concerns me in all honesty for Democrats, is from what I can see in the polls I've looked at, black people don't like Mayor Pete. At least not as their first choice. It's not that they don't like him, but he is not, doing a great job with that group, which is going to be, and again, not just saying African Americans, but any minority group is going to play a crucial role here in terms of turning out the vote, getting support, and getting things done. And I'm not sure Mayor Pete's figured out how to crack that yet. And obviously everything that happened with, everything in South Bend, the very contentious town hall meeting. Again, I'd say beyond contentious. I think that was Mayor Pete getting, not embarrassed, but that was not a good evening for Mayor Pete. In any way, shape, or form. It was on a very local issue, a very hot-button issue. But I'm not sure how he turns that corner, because being a candidate who does really well with 20% of the voters is not going to work for the Democrats today. It'll get you through a primary pretty far. I mean, my God, you divide the number of Democrats in the country by 4,800, and we have, what you need to win a primary. But what's he need to do to relate and show better with other groups? Does he need to, I guess? Maybe that's the more proper first question.
Well, I think you brought up this issue about, how do you crack that nut? And I don't think he's going to get that far. I don't think he's going to get that chance to do it. I think that, there was a time before the present administration where we would be saying things like, it's a long way from being a mayor to being president, right? We used to talk about the stair steps of political experience that you need to accomplish in order to ascend in rank to be the leader of the free world. Well, obviously, Trump has blown a curve on that. And so here's somebody who's young and he's charismatic, and he has brought some things to the forefront in a non-threatening, charismatic way that resonates with a very generous aspect of the liberal side of the continuum. How that's going to reach and how that's going to play with the mainstream voters, I don't think there's as much there, because again, if we were to go out there and say to people, what's the one thing when you think about Mayor Pete, what's his signature political accomplishment? What does he bring to the table as a candidate for president that would say, among those 20 Democrats, he's the one who I want to take on Donald Trump in the general election? What's that defining thing? I mean, there's a lot of things that are involved with his presence, right, on a discursive terrain and in the media. But in terms of substantive policy, what's there? And I think also another thing that's relevant when we look at the finances is also looking at some of the candidates that seem to be stalling a little bit. Like right now, the way that we're talking about Mayor Pete is the way that we were talking about Beto O'Rourke, right? That a year ago, he was the rising star who looked like he had limitless potential. But there seems to be a little bit of a stall in terms of his fundraising in the second quarter. If you look at Gillibrand and if you look at Booker and Klobuchar, there are candidates who they're not waning necessarily, but they're not bringing in a second quarter the funding that can really offset what the other candidates bring to the table. The giant gap. And I think, when we start thinking about things that's going to ultimately be separating out the Democratic candidates in the coming days, weeks, and months, money goes far. Money is very consequential. And I think that when we think about
Let me ask you this, Brian, because this keeps coming up in the Politics Guys Facebook page. Do you think it's realistic or even necessary to strip money completely out of politics?
Realistic? No.
Oh, no, we all know it's not realistic. I mean, this is Don Quixotean in terms of chasing windmills to think money's leaving.
Right.
But do you think it should be? Do you think there's benefits? Do you think there's costs?
I think that in an ideal world, we would say, this is the illusion of rational choice theory, right? That people would look and they would deploy their mathematical calculus and they would look and say, what's the proximity between, these anonymous candidates and I on these issues? And then dispassionately, I choose this person. And it's all about what prevails in a marketplace of ideas.
That's not how you vote?
That's not how I vote. We also know that it comes down to all these other intangibles. And I think that, money, because there's other ways to look at it too, that, from a really particular, hard liberal angle, we could say that money corrupts, nearly absolutely. It's almost like power in a way. On the other hand, how are you going to, especially given, let's look at what the media are right now. How are you going to get your authentic message through when so much of what people perceive to be news is really infotainment, right? You got to buy that share. You got to buy that market share. Unless and until we were to smooth a curve and say the only purpose of the news is to broadcast factual information on a 24-hour basis, that's not the news that we could use or the news that voters choose. So you've got to be able to invest into the process in order to establish your market share.
We have the AP, though. They kind of do that. But again,
kind of? Yeah.
Not as much now as they used to.
Yeah, and I think there is that, but let's look also, where does the average voter go to get his or her information pertinent to their voting behavior?
Great question.
We know this, right? We know that there's a selection bias.
Oh, yeah. They go to their friends. They go to like-minded people. They go to like-minded sites. I don't want to read the opposition unless I want to get a laugh or strengthen my own argument.
You stay within your little bubble, and and this is part of the other conversations that we've had about the Trump juggernaut, which is don't even pay attention to the news. Just listen to me. I am the news, right? I'll push it out there. I'll broadcast it. And is it right? No. Is it factual? No. Is it crazy? Yeah. Does the average voter care? No. Why? Because they're hearing what they want to hear from the person who they trust and who they want to hear it from.
Yeah.
And I think
they're going to take them to where they want to go.
Yeah. And I'm not going to, I don't want to come across as, holy crap. I remember, Brian was the democratic socialist that we all knew and didn't love. And now he sounds like this hardcore capitalist. But the reality is polarization. If you were to say, let's just not allow money to be in politics, how do you do that given the media's presence and voting behavior and where we choose to select our news, right? It ain't going to work.
It's not going to work. It's not going to fit the model. And to be honest, I mean, for me, the folks that seem to be the most unhappy about money in politics are a lot of people who like candidates that even with the money, I'm not sure would be able to get the attention they want them to have. And again, if I think about it, I mean, Bernie Sanders didn't lose to Hillary because he didn't have money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a little bit of irony also that when you're Bernie Sanders, and again, I'm not being critical of the candidates when I say this, but when you think about the amount of wealth associated with the war chest of a person who is the quote unquote outsider, of the person who is not the capitalist of the bunch, but yet his war chest and his bankroll is substantial, I think that says a lot about the political system, right? That even if you reject the economic system, you still got to pay to get in order to win, in order to dismantle the thing.
Yeah, that is kind of ironic. Let's think about the Democrats. I mean, we obviously have the next Democratic debate coming up. Again, my favorite punching bag has apparently now qualified somehow. Tim Ryan found out this week that he'll be there. I'll be honest, the fact that the Tim Ryans and the others that are like Ryan, equally not unlikely, but not going to be the nominee, keep getting invited, it makes me immediately say, what value is this debate going to have again? And as a Democrat, I'd ask you this almost. Are you actually going to get value from this? I mean, is this going to be a debate where we start to see separation, where we have an opportunity to see who out of that middle pack that has some name recognition and has some actual money can figure out who has a chance to jump up versus fall down, or how the top's doing? Or is this something that, we made sure that we had all of these people because we just ultimately needed to have a live draft where we pick where they're going to stand on stage? Because all of the analysis I've seen in the last few weeks, and there was a really good article about it this week, was there may be 24 Democrats running for president, but at the end of the day, Biden, Mayor Pete, Senator Harris, Senator Sanders, and Senator Warren are the only ones that voters and donors seem to even care about.
Well, you just took away everything that I was going to say. But, the fact of the matter is when you said, what does it matter? Are we going to get anything out of this? And have we got anything out of this? I think if you look at the individual level and say Harris sure did, right? Because, when you have somebody squaring off, for example, against Biden, and suddenly, remember the bump that she got, right? You get money coming in. So you look at some of the investment that goes into our campaign. You have your moment where you go toe to toe with the old guard of the Democratic Party, and you hold your own, and you come out looking pretty darn good. For Harris, that strategy worked really well, right? So she's in a pretty good position as a result of the debates. The reality is, and to me, the most interesting question is, which candidates get to debate on what night, right? Because it's not so much that it's like open up the floodgate and let everybody in. And I was reading, the methodology that's used to help determine the positioning of the candidates. And you think about these tiers, right? You got the top tier, the middle tier, and a bottom tier. And a bottom tier, are where we find Bennett and Bullock and Ryan, your favorite person, and Inslee and Hickenlooper and people like this. In the middle tier, you've got Mayor Pete, and you got Booker, and you've got O'Rourke and Castro, for example. But the top tier is Biden, Harris, Warren, and Sanders, right? And I don't think anybody's going to be surprised that the debate is really going to focus around which one of these four, and I'll give it a +2 here, right? Biden, Harris, Sanders, Warren, Booker, and potentially Mayor Pete are going to rise to the surface as a result of this. Because, as we talked about a minute ago, Booker's campaign contributions have stalled a little bit. O'Rourke's campaign contributions have stalled a little bit.
Well, after that last debate, I'm surprised Beto has anybody still sending money.
I agree. He's got a strong base of support. I mean, for the people who like him, they love him, right? It's because he made that connection a while ago before we started heating up and even talking about campaign season. And so he does have that particular base. Now, the question is, what candidate's going to pull that in? Because let's push O'Rourke out, right? For the sake of argument and also for the sake of reality. I don't think he's going to go very much farther. Who's going to pick up those pieces? Because really what we have to find in Warren, Sanders, Harris, Biden, or Mayor Pete, for example, is which one of these candidates is going to help represent a platform for the party that goes against Trump's portrayal of the party as one being in disarray. And if people say, oh, no, look, they're organizing, they're not in disarray anymore, they'll be like, oh, don't forget, they're crazy, right?
Yeah, they're all
nuts.
If
he looks at the squad, so all that conversation that we've had about the tweets that came out being, in my opinion, very strategic and very calculated, was a way to be able to portray the party as the fringe, to portray the party as the squad. And for the candidates who want to run, they're going to have to deal with the identity crisis that they have that's being, fabricated by the right as well. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what lessons Biden learned from the last time around. I'm hoping that there's going to be something that's going to be a mark of distinction, and I'm hoping, I'm curious about the top tier candidates. If it's going to be, quote unquote boy girl, squaring off when we have Biden, Harris, Sanders, and Warren, really as the top four. What's it going to be like when we see them coming at the divisive issues that define the current landscape? And Warren and Sanders have the strong economic message. It's a different economic message, but they're focused on economic justice. And, and Warren's tough. She's smart. She's got a sound policy.
Super smart.
Does it resonate with the voters?
No.
Is going to be the issue, right? Especially.
Well, I'll put it this way. It sure doesn't resonate with anybody sitting moderate right.
Exactly. If you're looking about the meaty middle, right, and if you want to sway people over to the other side, if their perception is that the economy is doing all right, the argument for economic justice is not going to fly. So the question is Biden, and let's think also about the population of voters that's ascending and is so critical here, which is the non-white non-Republican, non-white vote? Who's going to be able to court that? Who's going to be able to bring in the historically marginalized groups and mobilize a base of support that is Democratic identifying or Democratic leaning in the election? And here, we've talked previously about this, that Joe Biden has a particular advantage. So does Harris. They probably, if they were to see Elizabeth Warren's economic argument, be very swayed by it. But it requires a high degree of voter sophistication and I'm not going to say that Warren is aloof or inaccessible, but it's a very intellectually, almost academically built proposal, right? And it's hard to make that relatable to, for example, the economic underclass when it seems like it should be obvious.
Absolutely. I think that's fair. And I do think it's interesting, obviously, with the way that they chose to split and how they chose their metrics. And you made the point that Harris saw such a positive jump going toe to toe with Biden. It just makes me wonder, do we need more moments like that? But to get to that, we need the right people on stage. And I'm not convinced that this approach of allowing everybody and having the views heard and the voices heard is what we need. But again, I'm sitting on the right. We've been through this. Democrats openly mocked us for the number of debates and the number of candidates. And instead of doing anything to change that, you seem to be following our blueprint. Now, again, our blueprint worked for us, so hell, maybe it will for you guys too.
Well, it's really just, and it's a point that I made previously. It's too many cooks in the kitchen, and everybody's saying that they've got the secret sauce, but nobody really is like bringing it out there to where all the judges could be like if it was a barbecue cook-off, would be like, that's the best damn barbecue sauce I've ever had, right? That's not emerging yet. There's nothing there's not been that galvanizing soundbite, right? Those are the kinds of things that you kind of want at the stage. Yep. Is who says what that's going to make people start repeating it over and over and over again? Because, love or hate Trump, and we know where you and I and, well, everybody in the country stands on that side or the other. There is a message that's out there, right? On a daily basis, there's something out there that people will repeat and chant, and we don't really have the repeating and the chanting, at least in the numbers that could give you the numbers sufficient to carry the election with the Electoral College, right? Getting a popular vote, again, a popular vote might not be the important thing, but our system is built upon the popular vote matters, but the Electoral College vote is what seats the president.
Yep. And again, I would disagree. I think Marianne Williamson has done a great job of having easily repeatable lines, and can't wait to hear a couple of more from her on the 30th and 31st.
Well, yeah.
Probably not ones Democrats want repeated, but talk about meme material right there.
Exactly. And that's the thing, right? That if you looked at it from a consulting standpoint, you'd be like, where is our keep hope alive, right? Where is that galvanizing? Is the economy stupid? Whatever it is, where is that? And maybe because this is early, we haven't gotten there yet. But we don't have that critical distinction. We have distinction by identity. We can look and see a difference between the candidates. We could hear a difference between the candidates. We could see a difference in terms of the political careers and political acumen. But we don't yet have that distinction that's allowing people to see, kind of like a magnet, what's pulling the voters towards them. That's not really emerging yet.
Yeah, at least not clearly. Well,
it'd be fun if it happened next week.
Could. Who knows? Or we should just have another fun mess. So let's switch gears a little bit. Interesting story that kept coming up over the last week on a lot of different sites with a lot of different analyses was the trip Abigail Disney took to Disneyland. Disney World is a very favorite place of mine, as you know. I mean, I'm getting married there in December. I love going. We've been annual pass holders since we got to Florida. But when I look at this story and the outcry from this Disney heiress about what Bob Iger is making at roughly $66 million a year versus what the average worker is making, and how they're telling her that there's no way that they can keep living and they're living paycheck to paycheck, and it's hard to be, in the Disney spirit and bringing joy and being warm, while thinking about the fact that they're going to, and I believe the quote was, go home and forage for food in other people's garbage. It definitely raises the question, the broader question about capitalism in the United States and the wage gap that you've mentioned previously on the show, Brian. You and I were joking about this story and how we were going to approach it before we started recording, and you made up the point of, Bob Iger sitting in an air-conditioned office is obviously in a different place than some minimum wage earning 18-year-old wearing a Winnie the Pooh costume. But there's a whole lot of truth to that. What do you think about this whole story, the concept of Bob Iger makes $66 million and that kid makes whatever minimum wage is in California today, but still has the living expenses of being in California today? Is this a problem, or is just this the nature of what happens in a truly capitalistic society that's looking to allow individuals to control their destiny?
I think it is. This, in some ways, is for many the example of democracy not democracy, capitalism at its finest. For others of
that would
us,
be me.
This would be, hey man, there's something really wrong with the way the system is. Now I'll tell you, the first story that I clicked on, I cracked up when I saw. I was so livid, says Disney heiress, right? And the whole idea of
heiress,
when you have the word heiress, that's part of your title. It's very bourgeois. It's very much like, I don't really relate with this population that I'm talking about, but I want the world to. And she's presented this really pure notion about, like, when my grandfather and his brother started Disney Corporation and Disney World and everything else, they wanted people who were going to come there and work there for life. And there was like 200,000 employees scattered all over the place. And, again, how many people are going to like work for life as, what do? I'm Winnie the Pooh. And when I was 18 years old, I got a job at the theme park and I was Winnie the Pooh. And now I'm benefits eligible for retirement and I'm Winnie the Pooh. I'm retiring my costume. It really doesn't work like that. Now, I do believe that there is something to be said for the colossal wage gap. Is there something really wrong with our sense of economic entitlement to say that the guy who runs the quote-unquote happiest place on earth should make $65 million a year? That's incomprehensible. That's like monopoly money, right? I can't even imagine what that would be like.
I bet I could figure out how to spend that somehow.
I could blow it in a heartbeat, I'm sure.
Property taxes the second year would kill me.
Yeah, there would be that. But if you look at the other end also, the reality is many of us don't identify with the economic underclass that is, literally, when she said Bob needs to understand that he's an employee just the same as the people scrubbing gum off the sidewalks are employees. And when she makes a comment about, the people who work there, and, Anaheim is, close to a pretty nice part of, Southern California. And the cost of living is obviously going to be high. And when people are literally living paycheck to paycheck, even if they're not literally foraging for food in other people's garbage cans, they're making an extremely meager wage, to say the least, in a place that's notorious for a high cost of living. So what's the offset here?
And it keeps charging consumers. Let's be honest. Disney's making money still.
Go. Yeah, it's expensive. So the question is, and I think this is one of the debates that we hear, in capitalism, even if this wasn't Disney, the question would be, what do we make of and what do we do about the gap between the richest and the poorest, right? And the argument is, how much political inertia is there to change that when so many people have as their dream, what do you want to be when you get older? And I ask students this all the time, like, how do you see yourself in 10 years? What do you want to be? And a lot of students will just say rich, and they're only half tongue in cheek when they say that, right? And so what we have is a system that could really legitimize this level of obscene wealth that's for a very privileged few. But the reality for many people, and part of the illusion of economic performance, is that we have more people who might be employed, but they're also representative of a larger and growing economic underclass, where the level of economic compensation is at or below the poverty line. So what do we do about this when we have, for example, members of Congress who make $30 million a year when his salary is, not that high, $175,000 or something, right? That's high compared to a lot of people, but it doesn't offset the 30 million that they have. So what we have is a real gap, and how much political inertia is there to do something in a capitalist society to smooth that curve? We've had the conversations about the flat taxes. We've had conversations about trickle down economics. We've had conversations about fundamentally altering the type of political economy that we have, to Elizabeth Warren's proposal for a wealth tax. And I don't see right now a lot of traction moving in a direction to say, let's just change our economic system.
Yeah,
It's not about changing Disney. It's about our economic system. Disney.
You better not change Disney.
Well, but Disney, this like right now in a moment, the heiress goes there and is like, this is not the Disney of my youth. My family would be rolling over in their graves if they saw this. And she's probably right. They probably would be. However,
James Madison would be rolling over too. He'd want to know what a cell phone is.
And so the question is this really about Disney, or is it really about the economy? It's really about the economy. And more fundamentally, it's really about the economic system. And it's not really about Disney. Can Disney do something to offset that? Absolutely, they could. But how much of an incentive does the Walt Disney Corporation have to take Bob Iger down from almost $66 million a year in order to fill that huge gap between his earnings and the cumulative earnings of all other Disney workers?
Yeah, and what does that cause in leadership? It raises so many questions, and I think that's what's hardest. I mean, to some degree, we're at the point where we're in the middle of a game that it doesn't seem possible to change the rules at that fundamental level today without causing outright chaos.
Right.
And again, I will openly admit here on this show that, being on the right side of this equation makes me even less willing to think about doing that. But
the ideological right.
yes, dear Lord, yes. Not on the Bob Iger side. But that's what it's going to take. I mean, we can't expect, what happens if Walt Disney decides, okay, so we're going to cut our CEO, or Bob Iger says, I'm just going to take a $1 salary. Do people think that all of a sudden Disney World and Disneyland are going to be free? That's just not how this profiteering is going to work in society today, and it's definitely something to be considerate of. But to your point, I'm not sure that the way that she went public with this story necessarily helped prove it. I mean, the idea that they're getting full pay minimum wage, there are people who would die to have a job at Disneyland who can't get one. Because they need the money. So it's just a very interesting conversation that I've seen. And again, it's raised a lot of interesting points, and I think got people talking about it in a way that I haven't seen recently, at least not as poignantly or focused on one case, which does at least add some color to it compared to just the general everybody needs to get paid more arguments I hear that are as frequent as, people telling higher ed that the first 2 years of higher ed should be free no matter what, without recognizing that, sure, while Tennessee did a great job with that and Governor Haslam deserves all the praise in the world, they had the infrastructure in place to help that happen, and they also had the lack of private schools to really push back on it, versus walking into any school and saying that, or any state and saying that, without thinking about the actual repercussions. It's pretty difficult.
Yeah, and I think when you made the comment about like what's Disney really going to do, is Bob going to say, I'll take $1 salary next year? That's the kind of movie that would star Adam Sandler, right? Where you've got the evil maniacal person who's somebody portrayed that way, who's making all this money, and then they see what life is like among other people. Or it's like, this was kind of like Undercover Boss, except it was Undercover Heiress, right? And you go and see this and you're like, what are we going to do about this? And you find one or two people, and it's like, we're going to give your family a vacation, and we're going to give you a new house, and we're going to help you get a better job, and we're going to let you complete that education. And you can have those high profile cases for a small number of people. You could create some programs that could really benefit select people. But the reality is, it's really only in Hollywood where somebody has that crisis of consciousness and says, there's something very wrong. I should not be making this much money. Take my wealth, right? And give it to Tiny Tim. Give it to all the people who are really, truly deserving out there. That happens in the movies. It doesn't happen in a corporate capitalist system. Now, again, coming at it from the left, I don't really like corporate capitalism. I see it as fundamentally unfair, and I see the cost of capitalism being paid at the expense of genuine democracy. But how do you change and dismantle the economic system to be able to get to the root cause that's allowing Bob Iger to make $66 million and to make the Winnie the Pooh costume wearing person, I don't know what the salary is. I can't even estimate it, but I would bet that it's not 64
It's not
million.
66 million. Yeah, it's not 64 million, but it's still probably equal to or more than the person working at a fast food restaurant. And I would argue that it's more than what a bunch of potentially unemployed people would be willing to pay or take similar work. And that's where I think that bottom half of the equation gets always brought up. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support's what keeps the show going, and we truly appreciate it. When you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show on Patreon, you get not only our gratitude, but you also get the supporters exclusive bonus episode each week that we put up right after the Saturday show. And supporters at various levels can get additional bonuses like Politics Guys gear. I've seen mugs, I've seen tote bags, and access to a special supporters only Facebook group. To learn more, go to patreon.com/politicsguys or visit the support page on our website, politicsguys.com/support. Subscribing to the show also helps us out, as does sharing episodes. We always rely on word of mouth. That's our best advertising, so we appreciate that, along with your reviews and ratings on whatever podcast app you're using to get to us. If you have questions, comments, corrections, concerns, or just generally want to vent to us, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com or at our Facebook page, where you can message us and share throughout the week. It's facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we're on Twitter at politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, Andra Massacre, and Benji Fishman. This show is produced by Will Miller. We'll be back with a new episode on Saturday, and we hope you'll join us then. Thanks.